Yes, we're going to uncover some things. And I thought this video, this podcast with Jimmy Corsetti, Dan from Debunking on Joe Rogan was really good. It's in the spirit of like the Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson interviews. If you have watched any of those or listened to any of those, it's really what started to attract me to Joe Rogan's podcast was a willingness to question the sort of established historical narrative. Now, when I say that, really it's very newly established, like our modern sort of materialist view of history, post-Enlightenment view, however you want to frame it, is pretty new. And so it's not really established. For thousands of years, people looked at history different. Did we invent a new story of human history? Graham Hancock would say we're a species with amnesia, and we've sort of forgotten all these old stories, or we've dismissed them as myths or fairy tales. And so there's no giants, there's no dragons. There's just a slow process of evolution that has taken place to bring us to the present moment. And I think that's one of the things that is being challenged by this conversation. So we are recreating a conversation. If you want to listen to the original conversation, links are in the description. You can go find it on Joe Rogan's podcast. We are using this conversation as a backdrop for you and me to have a conversation. You and I are going to have a new conversation built off of this conversation. And so, yes, I'm going to pause it. Something's going to come to my mind. Maybe you'll put something in the chat. I might read that. We're going to bounce off of this. And so think of this more as a backdrop. And again, if you want to watch the whole thing uninterrupted, obviously you can go find it. But this is something new. This is a new conversation that we're having.
The foundation of Baalbek is completely undocumented. Go ahead.
You were saying something about dating it to 11,000 years.
Jamie, if you go to the Baalbek folder, you'll find an encyclopedia article that describes the evidence of human habitation at Baalbek dating back 9,000 BC, which is 11,000 years ago. I'm not suggesting these stones were created back then. I'm open to it.
What is the evidence? Like what kind of evidence? Pottery?
Sure. I'd have to go read through the scientific article, but humans were there 11,000 years ago.
Okay.
And the fact that they don't document when the Romans were, there. And there's another
history that dates back at least 11,000 years, encompassing significant periods such as prehistoric, Canaanite, Hellenistic, and Roman eras. After Alexander the Great conquered the city in 334 BCE, he renamed it Heliopolis, Greek for Sun City. The city flourished under Roman rule.
Now, let me say this real quick, Jamie. Will you go to the picture of the mountains in this folder? Because here's something that people need to understand that is unbelievably significant, which is that at Baalbek, there are approximately 200 rose granite columns that were transported from the Aswan Quarry in Egypt, which is 700 miles as the bird flies. And what's wild is that the only way to get them to Baalbek, because the Baalbek is located in the middle of the Lebanon mountains, it has an average elevation of 8,000 feet with peaks reaching over 10,000 feet. As you can see, there's a frickin' ski resort there. They had to bring all of those multi-ton stone columns from Egypt, and the only way to get there was over these mountains, which is mind-blowing.
What people need to understand is that doesn't take into account elevation changes.
Right.
So if you have a flat line like a bird and you're flying from one point to another, that's 700 miles. But if you have to go up and down and up and down and up and down, it's significantly larger. It's not 700 miles. It's probably double that.
Right. And that's an excellent point. And it's like, then the question is like, why would they do this? Like, why would they go out of the... How and why?
Why is like it's cool,
but how is
the real question. Like obviously we built things because it's cool,
right?
If you go to the Acropolis and the Parthenon, you go, why'd they do it? Well, it's cool, But like people like to leave cool shit behind,
right?
So they get fixated on the how and I feel like that is kind of like the modern approach, but the why for me is really significant. Now, Baalbek is an interesting one. Because it is such an ancient site. And it's interesting for me as a Bible student because it coincides with some Bible history that is interesting. And so you would think, okay, what the Greeks did was pretty impressive, but actually what the Greeks did was built on top of something that was already there. And what was already there was even more impressive. And so the further back you go, the more impressive things get. Now, why is that a problem? Okay, that's part of this conversation. What is it that Joe and his friends are uncovering as they look into this history, because again, the why, I think, is very important. Why did they do that? The how is really important, because I think when we look at the how, we realize these people were incredibly capable. And then why did they do this? Well, this is a center of worship, and this is a place of worship. So you're telling me that ancient people, foragers, gatherers, hunters, living this primitive lifestyle, took time to make these incredibly advanced centers of worship. And you might think, oh yeah, the pagan mind, or the primitive mind, thinking that gods exist, thinking that spirits exist, yuck, 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 right? Thinking that the tree has a spirit and thinking the river has a spirit. And we look back with this sort of chronological snobbery and we say how foolish they must have been. Well, they're clearly not foolish. They're clearly not foolish people. And they clearly had a point for making this. They went out of their way to do these things. So they were not living hand to mouth the way we might want to think. As we moderns look back into ancient history, we assume it gets more and more primitive. Well, some people assume. I don't assume. There's an assumption that it gets more and more primitive, and the further back you go, and they're talking about this being 11,000 years ago, potentially, these people must have been living very primitively, very hand-to-mouth, starving mostly, fighting off the winter mostly. Why would they take time to build a temple? Because that, to me, is part of what makes this a fascinating question. Why did they? It doesn't serve any utilitarian function for people who are trying to get food, survive the winter, fight off warring clans, right? It doesn't serve a utilitarian function. What the function of this, and Göbekli Tepe is the same. You look back on all these ancient sites. I don't know if I have. I think they go into Göbekli Tepe in this. These ancient sites are sites of worship, and that to me is a profound observation. They kind of skip over it in this conversation, which is of course why I'm clipping it and why I'm bringing it to your attention, hoping that, again, you and I can sort of make something else out of this. That Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, all of these places, not all of them, but it seems like the function of these ancient sites that we're discovering is one of worship. It's not a utilitarian function. It doesn't help you get clean water to your village or anything like that. The engineering marvels that our ancient ancestors left us coincide with the act of worship. That's not a point to be overlooked. Now, what you make of that, what we make of that, I don't know yet. But, of course, as a Christian, I go back to the Garden of Eden. Our purpose, we were made for worship, and then we fell into rebellion, but that design that we have didn't go away. Maybe it was perverted, twisted to a different purpose, or the attention was turned to a different object of worship. But that's still part of our design. And again, I don't think that these were foolish, primitive people thinking they clearly had things figured out. And so what they understood that we don't here in our modern time is that those spiritual forces are more prominent than we might believe today. That it was very important to be in tune with the cosmos, with spiritual forces. And I would say it is very important that we worship the one true God, that brings us back into harmony. And yet, how is that possible? How could we possibly do that? And I wonder if, you could go back to the Tower of Babel. I mean, what fallen humanity has done is attempted to reach back to God by our own strength. And then the motivation there is it sort of us trying to achieve godlike status? Is that why ancient people are so committed to these places of worship